In 1954, a dress cost $3.98. A school teacher in Iowa bought it on a Saturday afternoon with what was left of her paycheck, hung it in her closet, and wore it for the next 20 years. Not because she was sentimental, because it was still in perfect condition. Now think about the last thing you bought online. Will it survive December? Get this. The answer is almost certainly no. And the reason why has nothing to do with inflation, nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with progress. It has to do with a very specific decision that American corporations made sometime around 1973, a decision that killed an entire world of clothing and replaced it with something faster, cheaper, and disposable. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the world those dresses came from. Because it wasn't just a world of nice fabric and careful stitching. It was an entire economic system, a philosophy of how things should be made. And it disappeared so completely that most people under 50 don't even know it existed. I'm no fashion historian, I want to be clear about that. But I spent about 3 weeks reading everything I could find on mid-century American garment manufacturing. And I have to tell you, what I found genuinely surprised me. There's a book called What We Wore by Melinkoff, published in 1984. She interviewed hundreds of women about the clothes they actually wore between 1950 and 1980. Not the runway stuff, not the magazine fantasies. The real clothes, the ones hanging in real closets. That book is worth your time, and I'll mention it again later. But here is what struck me hardest. The American garment industry in the 1950s wasn't some romantic cottage operation. It was enormous. It was industrial. And it operated under a set of assumptions that would be considered insane by today's standards. Here's what I mean. In 1950, roughly 95% of the clothing Americans wore was made in America. 95%. Let that sit for a second. Today, that number is about 3%. 3. That's not a decline, that's an extinction event. We went from making almost everything we wore to making almost nothing. And it happened in about 40 years, faster than a single career, faster than a mortgage. You could have started your first job wearing American-made clothes and retired wearing clothes sewn in Bangladesh without ever noticing the switch. But in 1950, the system was alive and enormous. New York City alone had tens of thousands of garment workers. The blocks around 7th Avenue in Manhattan, what they called the Garment District, employed more people than most American cities had residents. Kansas City, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Portland. These weren't just cities. They were clothing factories disguised as cities. Every one of them had neighborhoods where the hum of sewing machines was the background noise of daily life, the way traffic is now. And here is the part that gets overlooked. The system was designed to serve ordinary women, not wealthy women, not society women, ordinary women. The school teacher, the secretary, the farm wife, the young mother making coffee before dawn. The entire apparatus, from the cotton mills in the South to the cutting rooms in Manhattan to the Sears catalog landing in a rural mailbox, was built to put well-made, attractive clothing within reach of a woman earning $35 a week. That was the system. And it produced brands that most Americans alive today have never heard of. Brands that dressed tens of millions of women. Brands that were as familiar as Coca-Cola and are now as forgotten as a rotary phone. So let's open that closet. The first name you need to know is Nelly Don. If you walked into a Sears in 1955 or thumbed through the dress racks at any small-town five and dime, Nelly Don was the first label you'd see. It was everywhere. On the dress your mother wore to fry bacon in the morning. On the dress she changed into before your father came home. On the dress she wore to back-to-school night with a small pin at the collar. The woman behind the label was Nell Donnelly, later Nell Donnelly Reed. And her story is one of those American stories that sounds made up, but isn't. She was born in 1889 in Parsons, Kansas, farm country. She started sewing dresses on her own kitchen table in 1916 because she was fed up. The house dresses American women were supposed to wear for housework were ugly, shapeless, colorless, depressing sacks. Nell Donnelly looked at those dresses and said, essentially, a woman scrubbing a floor still deserves to feel like a human being. That single idea built one of the largest dress companies in American history. By 1931, she had over 1,000 employees and was producing 5,000 dresses a day. 5,000. Every single day. By the early 50s, the Donnelly Garment Company was the largest manufacturer of women's clothing on the planet, operating out of a 206,000-square-foot factory in Kansas City. Over the life of the company, they produced 75 million dresses. That's not a typo. 75 million. To put that in some kind of physical perspective, if you laid those dresses end to end, they'd stretch from New York to Los Angeles and back. Twice. And here's the part that gets me. Most of those dresses cost between $3 and $7. A young mother in Iowa could own 10 of them. A widow in Tennessee could afford one new every spring and still wear last year's to Sunday service. They had small details, a piped collar, a tiny trim, a bow at the waist, buttons covered in matching fabric. Small things that made an ordinary Tuesday afternoon feel like it mattered. But Nell Donnelly's life wasn't just about dresses. In 1931, she was kidnapped, grabbed off the street along with her chauffeur, held for a $75,000 ransom. That's over $1.5 million in today's money. Her husband contacted James A. Reed, a former U.S. senator with deep connections to Kansas City's political machine, specifically to Tom Pendergast, the city's notorious boss. Reed reached out to Johnny Latzia, a local mobster in Pendergast's orbit. Latzia's underworld network found Donnelly within 34 hours. No ransom paid, no police involved. The Kansas City mob rescued the country's biggest dressmaker. You see the problem with calling the 50s simple? Nothing was simple. Within a year of the kidnapping, she divorced her husband, bought his share of the company for $1 million, and eventually married James Reed, the senator who saved her. She ran the company until 1956 and lived to be 102 years old. The company went bankrupt in 1978 under different ownership. When it closed, an entire generation of American women lost something they'd taken for granted. The dress that cost almost nothing, fit right, and lasted. If your mother is still alive, ask her if she remembers Nelly Don. Watch what happens to her face. All right, back to it. The next brand operated in a completely different universe. Bobby Brooks didn't dress mothers. Bobby Brooks dressed their daughters. The company was founded in Cleveland, Ohio in 1939 by Maurice Saltzman and Max Reiter, originally under the name Ritmore Sportswear. By the 50s, it had become something close to a religion for American teenage girls. Bobby Brooks specialized in what they called go-togethers, mix-and-match separates. A wool skirt in dusty rose, a coordinating sweater in cream, a blouse with a small collar. A girl with 3 Bobby Brooks pieces could feel like she had an entire wardrobe. Here's the business genius of it. The company maintained a consumer board of 600 teenage girls. 600. They weren't guessing what teenagers wanted. They were asking them, and then making exactly that. This was 1958. Nobody was doing market research on teenagers. Most companies treated teenage girls as small adults who should be grateful for whatever was available. Bobby Brooks treated them as a market, and the market responded. A sweater cost around $6. A skirt, maybe $8. But the price wasn't the point. The point was the ritual. The Saturday afternoon, a girl walked into a department store holding babysitting money in a small envelope, the way her mother let her pick it out herself for the first time, the way she wore it to school on Monday and felt, for the first time in her life, like a young woman instead of a child. If you watched Grease and wondered where Sandy got those perfectly coordinated outfits before Danny corrupted her, that was Bobby Brooks' energy, that exact world. The original company filed for bankruptcy in 1982. The name still exists today, sold and resold to discount retailers. But the clothes bearing that label now have nothing to do with the carefully tailored pieces a girl in '58 saved her babysitting money to buy. The label is the same. The world it came from is gone. The world. Now, if you opened a closet in 1956 and counted, there was a very good chance you'd find at least 4 ship-and-shore blouses inside. They were the working woman's quiet armor. The blouse you wore to the office, to church on Wednesday evenings, to lunch with your sister at the Woolworth's counter. The company started as the Susquehanna Waste Company in 1916 in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. They began using the ship-and-shore brand name around 1939. By the 50s, they were one of the most successful blouse manufacturers in American history. And here's what made them extraordinary: the fabric, a cotton that could be washed in the sink at night and worn the next morning, crisp as new. I want you to understand what that meant in 1955. Most American homes didn't have a dryer. A lot of them didn't have an automatic washing machine. Ironing a blouse was a 20-minute job with a heavy iron heated on a stove. Ship-and-shore gave women a blouse that didn't need ironing. For a tired mother who could rinse it out at 10 at night and wear it to her secretarial job at 8 the next morning, that wasn't a product feature. That was a rescue. A ship-and-shore blouse cost around $2 or $3. It came with small details: a Peter Pan collar, a tiny embroidered initial, mother-of-pearl buttons, a delicate cuff. They were sold at J.C. Penney, at Sears, at the Five and Dime in towns too small for a department store. The company stayed family-owned until 1977, then got bought by General Mills, of all companies. Yes, the cereal people owned a blouse company. The 50s were weird. By the late 80s, the original company was gone. Most American women under 50 have never heard the name. But somewhere in your grandmother's closet, behind the coat she never gave away, there's probably still one of those crisp white blouses, folded along its old creases, smelling faintly of starch and cedar. All right, here's where it gets interesting, because not every cheap brand was about practicality. Some of them were about dreams. In Paris in 1956, Christian Dior unveiled a new collection. Those dresses cost what a year of rent cost in a small American town. American women read about them in Vogue and sighed. 2 months later, a label called Suzy Perette would release something almost exactly like it for about $50 to $60. Suzy Perette wasn't a person. She was a marketing invention, a fictitious French-sounding name dreamed up by the Blauner brothers, Max and Sidney, who ran a company called Lombardy Dress out of West 37th Street in Manhattan. But the dresses were real, and they were remarkable. Sidney Blauner actually paid Christian Dior $2,000 plus royalties for the right to incorporate Dior's design ideas into affordable American dresses. That's right. He licensed the dream, legally, for $2,000. That's less than a single Dior dress cost retail. A secretary in Minneapolis who wanted to feel like Audrey Hepburn for an evening could put on a Suzy Perette, slip into a pair of white gloves, and walk into a Friday night that felt almost too elegant for her ordinary life. And the dress would last. It would still be hanging in her closet 30 years later, when her daughter would find it on a quiet afternoon and wear it to her own engagement dinner. The company closed around 1973. Victor Costa, who later became famous in his own right, was their last notable designer, working for the label from 65 to 73. The kind of company that turned Paris dreams into something an ordinary American woman could afford simply doesn't exist anymore. But more on that later. Let me stay with the big picture for a moment. One of the things that fascinated me while researching this is how many of these companies were started by immigrants or the children of immigrants. Henry Rosenfeld. He was the son of an Austrian immigrant, started as a shipping clerk in Manhattan's garment center, worked his way up to running someone else's dress company, then took $50,000 in savings and launched his own brand. Rosenfeld called himself the dressmaker to the masses. He said it as a point of pride, and in 1950s America, that was something to be proud of. His dresses sold at Macy's, at Gimbel's, at Lord & Taylor, at May Company, at hundreds of regional department stores from Boston to Sacramento. In 1945 alone, he grossed $8 million on sales of 2 million dresses to 12,000 stores. 2 million dresses in 1 year. To put that in today's terms, that's roughly $140 million in revenue from a company started by one guy with $50,000 and a shipping clerk's knowledge of the garment business. What was extraordinary about Rosenfeld dresses was the attention to small things. The way the bodice was lined, the way the hem was hand-finished, the way the buttons matched the piping, the way the waistline sat in exactly the right place. His dresses cost between about $11 and $20. They were not couture, they were not designer. They were beautifully made, everyday dresses for women who needed to look put together for the PTA meeting, the bridge club, the trip downtown to pay the electric bill, in a clean dress with a small purse over the forearm. These details cost more to produce. They put them in anyway, because that was how clothes were made then. Guess what? When manufacturing moved overseas in the 70s and 80s, brands like Henry Rosenfeld couldn't survive. They'd spent decades building a customer base that expected lined bodices and hand-finished hems. That kind of garment could no longer be made for $12 when competing against imports from countries where workers earned in a day what an American seamstress earned in an hour. The company faded. The name disappeared. And American women slowly, almost without noticing, stopped expecting their clothes to be made with care. Let me speed up a bit here because there are more names in this closet and each one carries its own ghost. Jonathan Logan. In 1957, it was the largest dress manufacturer in the United States, founded in 1944 by David Schwartz with just 10 employees. By 1969, it was the world's largest women's apparel manufacturer, with $250 million in annual sales. That's about $2 billion in today's money, from a company that started in a room smaller than most living rooms. By the late 60s, Jonathan Logan owned dozens of smaller labels, R&K Originals, Misty Harbor, Modern Juniors, and more. Here's a fact that I genuinely did not know before researching this. Liz Claiborne? Yes, that Liz Claiborne worked as a designer for Jonathan Logan's Youth Guild division from 1960 to 1975. One of the most famous names in American fashion got her start designing affordable dresses for a mass-market company in New Jersey. The factory where those dresses were made is now a parking lot. Carol Brent. She wasn't a real woman. She was Montgomery Ward's house brand of women's clothing, a name cooked up in a marketing department that suggested something refined and approachable. But the dresses were real, and for millions of rural American women, they were the entire wardrobe. A Carol Brent dress cost between $5 and $12 and arrived a few weeks after ordering in a brown paper parcel tied with string. A farm wife in Nebraska, a coal miner's wife in West Virginia, a teacher in a small Wyoming town with no train station. These were the women Carol Brent dressed. The dresses were durable, washable, modest, and pretty enough for church. They were the entire wardrobes of millions of women who lived too far from any city to know what was fashionable in Paris, and who would not have cared if they had. Montgomery Ward collapsed in 2001. Carol Brent had vanished from the catalog decades before that. Doris Dodson, another fictitious name, this time from Forest City Manufacturing in St. Louis. The label was aimed at junior-sized teenagers and young brides. It came out of a specific discovery in 1934, when a buyer at Klein's department store in St. Louis surveyed customers and found that young women wanted clothes that looked different from what their mothers wore. That insight, which seems obvious now but was revolutionary then, turned St. Louis into the manufacturing capital of junior, ready-to-wear fashion. Doris Dodson advertised in 17 magazine with delicate illustrations of teenage girls in full-skirted dresses. A girl saved for them. A girl wore one to her senior prom, her first job interview, the bus station the morning she left for college. What made those dresses unforgettable wasn't the design alone, but the moment in a girl's life they marked. The company closed in the late 60s, lost in the cultural shift toward something faster and looser and less ceremonial. White Stag. And this one really burns me up. White Stag started in Portland, Oregon, as an offshoot of the Hirsch-Weiss Manufacturing Company, which made outdoor gear for loggers and stockmen since 1907. In 1929, Harold Hirsch, the founder's son, came back from Dartmouth College, where he'd been skiing, and started making women's ski apparel. By the 50s, White Stag made some of the best women's sportswear in the country. Practical ski pants, outdoor jackets, slacks, made for actual movement. A White Stag wool jacket cost around $20, and a woman in Vermont could wear it for 30 winters and pass it to her daughter, who'd wear it for 30 more. Here's the kicker. In 2003, Walmart bought the White Stag trademark from the Warnaco Group for $29 million. Today, the clothes bearing the White Stag label are mass-produced overseas in synthetic fabrics, sold for almost nothing, and forgotten by the next season. We have the name. We have lost the thing. And this brings me to the part of the story that makes me genuinely angry. By 1980, about 70% of the clothing Americans bought was still made in the United States. 70%. Today, that number is roughly 3%. Between 1990 and 2011, approximately 750,000 American garment manufacturing jobs disappeared. That's the population of San Francisco, gone. The mid-70s saw the emergence of massive textile factories in China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, offering labor at a fraction of American costs. Trade deals like NAFTA in '94 effectively wiped out most import restrictions. The economics were brutal and simple. A dress that cost $12 to make in New Jersey could be made for $2 in Guangzhou. And here's the thing nobody likes to say out loud. The American consumer voted with her wallet. She chose the $2 dress. She chose it over and over again. Not because she didn't care about quality, she did, but the $2 dress looked fine on the rack. It looked fine in the mirror. It looked fine for the first 3 weeks. By the time it fell apart, she'd already bought another one, and then another one. And the system learned that it was more profitable to sell a woman 5 dresses that each lasted 6 months than one dress that lasted 10 years. Ellen Melinkoff in What We Wore puts it this way. She describes the moment, somewhere in the 70s, when women stopped thinking of clothes as possessions and started thinking of them as disposables. Not because women changed, because the clothes changed. The relationship changed. You can't form an attachment to something designed to be thrown away. I found 4 different versions of how this shift happened, by the way. Economists blame trade policy. Fashion historians blame fast fashion. Labor historians blame corporate greed. Cultural historians blame consumer culture. I've been going back and forth on this for weeks, and I think the honest answer is all of them are right, and none of them are entirely sufficient. But the result is the same. Let me tell you where these people ended up. Nell Donnelly retired in 1956, lived through the death of her company in '78, and died in 1991 at 102. She outlived her dresses by 13 years. David Schwartz, who built Jonathan Logan from 10 employees to a $250 million empire, saw it sold and broken apart in the '80s. The brands he created were scattered across different owners like furniture at an estate sale. Harold Hirsch of White Stag watched his father's outdoor heritage brand become a corporate property, passed from owner to owner until Walmart stuck the name on clothes that would have made his father's loggers laugh. Bobby Brooks, the company that asked 600 teenage girls what they wanted and then made exactly that, couldn't compete with imports that cost a third of what American manufacturing required. Ship and Shore, the family-owned company that gave working women a blouse they could wash in the sink, ended up owned by General Mills and then by Montgomery Ward, neither of which had any idea what the brand meant to the women who wore it. Each of these stories follows the same arc: American ingenuity, American craftsmanship, American success, foreign competition, corporate acquisition, dissolution, forgetting. And here's the part that sounds like a myth, but isn't. The clothes from these dead companies are still out there, in attics and thrift stores and the back corners of old closets. You can hold a Nelly Don dress from 1953 in your hands right now and feel that the cotton was real. You can see that the seams were finished. You can read the label of a company that no longer exists and recognize that something happened to us slowly, over the course of 2 generations, and whatever it was not entirely an improvement. The women who wore those dresses didn't know they were living through the last years of a certain kind of American manufacturing. They were just buying a dress for church, just folding clean laundry on a Tuesday afternoon, just walking through their lives in clothes that fit, in a country that still made things to last. Today, the average American woman buys 68 garments per year. In 1950, that number was about 9. She buys 7 times more clothing and keeps each piece for roughly a fifth as long. She spends more total dollars on clothes and gets less total value. The math works out to something like a hamster wheel. Run faster, buy more, keep less, repeat. But you already knew that. You felt it every time you pulled something off a hanger and watched a seam come apart in your hands. Every time a button popped on the second wearing. Every time a fabric pilled after one wash. You didn't need me to tell you the clothes got worse. You've been living it. I think what you needed was for someone to remind you that it wasn't always like this. That the $3 dress your mother bought on a Saturday in 1954 wasn't cheap in the way we mean cheap today. It was inexpensive. There's a difference. Cheap means disposable. Inexpensive means accessible. Your mother's dress was accessible. It was made by an American woman for American women, sewn in a factory in Kansas City by someone who knew that the person wearing it deserved buttons that matched and seams that held. That system is gone. The factories are parking lots. The brand names belong to corporations that use them as labels on imported synthetics. The seamstresses are retired or dead, and nobody replaced them. But the dresses are still in the closets. That's the strange part. The companies are gone, the factories are demolished, the workers are forgotten. But the dresses survived. 60, 70 years later, folded along their old creases, buttons still attached, seams still holding. Outlasting everything and everyone that made them. If you still have one somewhere in the back of a closet, take it out today. Hold it for a minute. you'll understand. Take care.